Okay. All right. So let's talk about organizational culture. Who's excited about tonight's class? Yay. Oh my God, amazing. Wait a minute. Oh, I'm going to get Cleo, except for now she's over there. Okay. So organizational culture. So the next class that we're going to have after this one, I'm really excited because we have a guest speaker, our first guest speaker, Emily Yee Claire. She is a consultant that works at the University of British Columbia, but also does her own consulting business in human resources. And her area of focus is anti-racism and anti-oppression. So she's going to talk to us about how you can apply anti-racism and anti-oppression in HR contexts. And she's going to be really concrete and practical. And so I'm hoping that the people here that are in HR will find it interesting, even if you don't have the the authority or the power in your own organization to do the things she's talking about. Even just thinking about the approaches that one can take, I think can be kind of exciting. So leading up to that, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at organizational culture. And so, for me, the reason why there's an image of bees here is because in a lot of ways, a beehive is like an organization. And actually, I was a bee farmer for a couple of months in Tasmania in Australia a long time ago. Yeah. And that's after I dropped out of school, I was like, I'm going to do other stuff. And one of the cool things that the bee farmer taught me was that you can actually tell how the beehive is feeling if you listen to the sound. So that the sound of the hive will tell you if the bees are in a good mood or not. And it kind of makes me think about organizations, because an organization is all these individual people that together create something bigger than them. And that something bigger has a certain feeling to it. Does that make sense? So an individual bee, the hum, you might be like, oh, it's just buzzing. But when you hear, and it was very weird to experience this, when you hear an entire hive humming and somebody saying, oh, that hive is in a bad mood, give it more steam to calm it down or whatever. It's a really interesting way of thinking about how as individuals we're one thing, but as a group we're something else. And we've been talking about teams. And so think about some of the groups that you've been in over the course of your life, whether it's a religious organization or a sports team or, teams at work or your family. Are you the same in every group? Do you act the same in every group? So, in some ways, within each team, we're going to see different behavior. And then when you look at a whole organization, you see different behavior. And so it's something to think about, what is organizational culture? And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. There's this quote here by Henry Mintzberg. I don't know if anyone here has heard of him, but he's actually from McGill. He's an organizational consultant. I think he's in the School of Business. And I really like this quote because I feel like it really helps me understand what organizational culture is. And so he says, an organization's structure is like its skeleton, flesh and blood. And so what we're going to be learning about in a few weeks is about organizational structure. And we're going to see how it's kind of like the skeleton. The culture of an organization are its beliefs and values and how those play out in the day-to-day. That's like its soul. So culture is like the life force that holds an organization together. So does anyone here like Star Wars? Any Star Wars fans? If anyone's a Star Wars fan, you get an automatic 10% more. Maybe that's how I should do marks, is just based on what movies you've seen. So, if you're a Star Wars fan, you'll understand that that's the force, right? The force, may the force be with you. That's the soul of an organization. That's the culture. When you see this quote, does that make sense, what I'm talking about? One of the things that is really tricky about the fact that culture is kind of like an organization's soul is that it's hard to pinpoint. you know, it's easy to say, oh, there's a person's skeleton, or there's a person's face, or there's a person's body. But when we're talking about what animates us, the energy that's kind of running things, you can't really pinpoint it, at least not in the same way. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking at tonight is how you go about pinpointing what culture looks like, because part of what organizational behavior as a field of study does is actually go into cultures and work with them to change them. So often how this looks is, you know, people that end up being change managers. You go into an organization and using your observational skills, you look at how individuals, teams, and structure interact with one another. And then you look at, okay, how do we make this more effective? That's the definition of organizational behavior, right? And then what you do is you say, okay, how they all interact is the organizational culture. What do we want to do to change it? And how successful are change projects typically? Does anybody know? If you want to change culture, is that easy to do? Yeah, people are shaking their heads. Yeah, it's really, really hard. And I'm really excited about the class on organizational change, because my friend Emma comes in and she talks about 2 change projects that she worked on as a consultant, one that went really well and one that bombed. And it's always really good to hear the failure, because it makes everybody feel better. Because, you know, you can have years of experience in this and still it'll screw up. And one of the reasons why is that organizational culture is one of the strongest energies that you can find. So imagine, have you ever seen a river where it's just the rapids are going in one direction, and imagine being in it and you know that you can't swim against the tide. Has anyone ever felt that? So yeah, so Lily's talking about an adaptation process in change, and that's true. At the same time, often that's not done very well and it still fails, right? Or you'll move a little bit, which is, it can actually be considered quite successful if you move a little bit. But I think there's some really interesting reasons why often organizational change doesn't work, and we'll talk about that. So Malika's saying it's kind of impossible to swim against the tide. And that's true. I think that organizational culture is a very strong. There's a famous quote, well, okay, famous in my field. If you're a dork, if you're super nerdy about this stuff, you're like, you'll know this quote, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what that means is you can have all the strategy, you can have all the ideas, you can have all the project plans, and you put them in the river of culture. And if it's strong enough, and if it's not wanting what you're offering, it's going to sweep it away. Has anyone experienced that? Either you yourself, or you've been in an organization where there's been a culture change initiative, or restructuring, and it often doesn't go very well. So we're going to take a look at that. But before we take a look at that, we have to kind of take a look at what organizational culture means. And so we're in classes 9 to 13 now, which means that we're moving to my favorite part of the cake. I say this every time, which is the organizational part. And so, we've talked about the individual layer. We've talked about how your personality, your perceptions, your emotions, your way of your belief system, your values, how all of these things have an influence on your experience at work. We've talked about teams. So, group development, conflict, communication, group development, how these things, how do teams actually function within an organization? So we've looked at those 2 layers, and now what we're doing is we're looking at the last layer, which is the larger organizational life. So in some ways it's like we've looked at one bee, we've looked at the bee with its friends, and now we're looking at the entire hive. I know this cake looks so good, doesn't it? The flowers look a little bit gross, like I wouldn't want to eat them, but maybe they're icing, or you can take them off. I don't know. Anyway, so here you go. Here's this basic model, right? And we can see how we've looked at all of the individual stuff. We've looked at the group level stuff. Now we're into the organizational level. So we're looking at all of the things in orange. So we're looking at structure, culture, change practices, and ultimately what these relate to is an organization able to survive and continue. So in a lot of ways, organizational culture is about that. Organizational culture is created and is about, whether or not organizations will ultimately survive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into some breakout rooms as always. That's one of the things that we do when we start. And the question that I want to ask you to ask today or tonight are, think of 3 key words that as a group you would associate with organizational culture. It doesn't have to be from the textbook, it doesn't have to be right. Just when you think of organizational culture, what are some of the words that come to mind? And the second question is a bit trickier. How do you think you identify an organization's culture? So imagine you're asked by me, I'm like, I'll give you $400 billion. I don't even know if that's like, I don't even know if that becomes trillion or something. But anyway, like if you go into an organization and you tell me about its culture, what would you do? What would you look for? What kinds of questions would you ask? How do you start to identify what an organization's soul, as Henry Mintzberg says, might be? So I'd say take a screenshot if you don't have the PowerPoint up so that the questions are in your group. If you have the PowerPoint up, then just pull it up and so that you can follow along with those questions. I'm creating the breakout rooms now, so go ahead and join your breakout room. And I'm just going to give you, not a ton of time on this one, maybe just 6 minutes or so. Okay, so at around 6:45, we'll come back to the main room and we can share a little bit. So I've opened the rooms now, so you can go ahead and join. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I always forget to do that. So absolutely, the interaction between employees and employers and stakeholders shows you observing the work environment, Christina. Excellent. Exactly. How other people interact with you. Previous employee reviews. Yes, the T. Do you mean that's like an expression, right? That's not the actual T. That's like the down low, right? Yeah, I'm 42, guys. I'm like. I'm like, oh, is that when you like talk about things like that are real? Oh my God, I'm such a nerd. Okay, right. So spill the tea, right? That's RuPaul, right? RuPaul spills the tea with what's her head. Anyway, you get what I mean? Yeah, the water cooler talk. So all of these things contribute to identifying the organization's culture. So you can see that it's not just what an organization says on paper, right? It's not what you see in the advertisements. It's not necessarily, there's a lot of different layers to it.
But when you first start working somewhere, or when you're out looking for jobs, of course they're gonna tell you, well, like their values, and say, well, they give you all their values, but then when you start working there, it's totally the opposite, right?
I mean, it's a good question, I think, Betty. Like, who here feels like where they work?
I worked at Air Transat, and it was completely the opposite of what their values are, like starting from the bosses.
Like
So
basically what they say their values are, I guess. Hey,
yeah.
yeah. Well,
That's
who
what I'm
here
saying.
works?
And I feel
Oh,
like
sorry,
it's
go
not
ahead.
the first. Oh, sorry. I feel like it's not the first job that I had that like turned out to be really bad, and that's why
Yeah,
I think sometimes they just say that because like they want to look good, but in reality, when you start working there, it's completely like shitty.
yeah, no, for sure. Alexandra is saying that she always talks about the way that we work in recruitment, which is great. Yeah, and I mean, put it this way, what is it like when someone is saying one thing and doing something else? How does that feel? What's your reaction when a person that says that they're like a certain way, or that they do certain things and then they don't? Yeah, eye roll,
No.
distrust, liars, right? So when we talk about the individual employee's motivation, and we talk ultimately about the ability for an organization to sustain itself, having a culture where you don't walk your talk is going to have a big impact on whether or not employees feel comfortable staying or going.
Yeah.
Um, is there anyone here that works in a place where you feel like how they talk about their culture and how you experience it is kind of similar?
Before Corona started, a week before, I got fired from a job where I was doing my internship there. And when I tell you, I was the only person of color there, and they fired me right before with no reasoning. And they just said, yeah, like, we're not really interested anymore after I passed the exam and everything. So for me, I knew it was something racial. It
Yeah.
had to be, and I was, it's not my first time, but yeah.
I mean, if we look at diversity and inclusion programs, we talked about that, a few weeks
Yeah.
ago. And I think that, I've worked with people. I'm working with someone right now, actually, where she's firing someone who's indigenous, and he was hired into the job as a token person. I don't know if that's ever happened to anyone. And when you have a culture that says, oh, we're diverse, but then the culture itself doesn't actually support a diverse workforce and set anybody up for success, then you end up in situations like that,
Yeah.
right?
That
So
they
so it
did.
can have a really big impact on people's well-being when, and so Alexandra is saying that one of your values is walk the walk, talk the talk for real. Is that actually one of your values, Alex, at your workplace? So if you work somewhere where the values that the workplace says it is and what you experience are the same, that's really great. I would also say, who here, thumbs up, maybe just do a reaction. Who here thinks about the values of the organization before you're hired? Who here looks for an organization whose values are in line with yours? Who here hasn't thought about it much yet? So when I was 34, it was the first time in my life where I thought to myself, oh, I can actually get a job where the values of the organization or the way that it works is what I want, not just do they want me. Before, I would always be like, what do you want? I'll sing and dance. La, 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 la. Oh, I think I promised Isabel a song, right? Oh, cause I'm your lady and you are my man. I don't know why that's the first song I thought of. Whenever you reach for me. I actually hate this song. I'll do all that I can. Although it's kind of a great song. Anyway, so there you go, Isabel. And now what I'm realizing is that it's actually totally okay to find and look for organizations that will actually fit the cultural values that I want to see, which is the reason why I run my own business. Because it's really hard to find good organizations from my perspective. Okay. But so we've been talking about organizational culture. You've given some examples. The words that you used were really like so appropriate. The reason why I have people here that are dressed identical is that in a lot of ways, what organizational culture is the way in which we kind of establish norms. How do we all appear somewhat the same? So it's a pattern of shared assumptions that we learn. So it's basically, I would be so into a virtual karaoke party, just saying. It's basically the norms that we all learn and agree to, but they're learned, right? So it's not like you get there and you know them right away. I've talked about this example before. When you show up at a friend's house for dinner, who here feels like you're watching their family and part of you doesn't understand exactly what's going on? You don't know exactly how to behave, because it's a different set of norms than you're used to. And then think about your own family norms. They're probably stuff you don't think about your family as having basic assumptions because that's what you have learned in terms of how to behave. So an organization's culture is very similar in that way. It's a pattern of shared beliefs that when you start at an organization, you're taught. And how that works, and the reason why that works is because the organization at some point decided, either explicitly or implicitly, which means either they talked about it or it just sort of happened, that there are certain behaviors that will lead to surviving. So we behave in certain ways so that we can stay alive as an organization. And so what that means is that an organization starts, it has certain things that it thinks it has to do in order to survive, and those things become behaviors that over time, if the organization stays alive, it's going to continue. And that these behaviors are taught to people who join. as the correct way to think, to perceive, to feel, to act, to engage. So for instance, at McGill, one of the things that I learned was that it's a hierarchy. So I can't just email someone who's above someone else unless I get an introduction. And I'm the kind of person that just tends to email. I don't think too often. It's not my norm. But I had to learn that at McGill, that was something that I had to do. Does that make sense to people? And where organizations get stuck is when they keep using behaviors that once worked but don't work anymore. Does anyone have that in their lives, behavior that you tend to do sometimes because that worked at some point, but it's not necessarily super beneficial for you anymore? Like I don't know, like whatever it is, like there's ways in which we cope and we get survival skills that are really important, but as we grow and develop, we maybe can let some of those go. But you can see how it's really hard to do that when those are the skills that you've relied on culture that are like that. And in a lot of ways, what this means, my internet's unstable, so I'm sorry if it's okay. No, it's fine. Is that it also tells us the difference between one organization and another. So, for instance, is Apple, the computer company, different from what's the Microsoft? When you think of those two, do you feel like culturally they're different? How would you describe Apple? Give me one or two words to describe what you would imagine Apple's culture is. Young, cool, right? Fancy, modern, innovative, trendy, structured but casual. Exactly. Always on the go. Okay. What about Microsoft? What would be some of the words you would use to describe Microsoft? Business, classic, old fashioned, a bit old, boring, family, for everyone. So you can see how computer companies making products similar in terms of those things, right? They're not that different in terms of their mandates. The difference is their cultural identity. And what culture does is it gives people a sense of the difference between one company and another. Lily's saying squarish. I love that, right? So Microsoft is a square, Apple's probably more squiggle, if people remember the identity, right? So you can see how organizational culture is a powerful thing. And the reason why organizational culture exists is, again, to ensure adaptability, survivability, or the opposite, right? So can anyone think of an organizational culture that has not lasted, a company or a group where the way the culture works has meant that it has not been successful, where a company has even like shut down?
Well, I'm thinking of Target and the
Right.
whole,
Yes.
right? That's me, the only thing that popped in my head.
That popped into my head too. So tell me more about that.
Well, you know the story. I mean, they came here to Canada thinking that it was going to work great, just the way it was working in the US. And what, in less than 2 years, they picked up and they left because, the whole mandate, the whole culture, the way they rolled out the operations wasn't in line with Canadians. What do you call it? The way we do things.
Totally. Yeah, great example. That's the one that popped into my head too. There's Zellers. Oh my God, you guys remember Zellers?
Sellers.
What about Sears? Remember Sears? Yeah, I'm old enough that I remember when Sears, you would go and you would get like, there was like a trolley and you would order and it would come out on the trolley, man.
Remember Consumers?
Yeah, Consumers Distributing. I think that's what I was talking about. Right. Oh my God, the magazine for Sears. So many good looks.
I was so excited as a kid just to get the magazine from Sears and see all the toys.
Oh my God, of course, right? So, but it's so yeah, and some people are putting in some things that I've never heard of, like Diana Bread. I've never heard of Diana. Is it a lady named Diana, or that's something?
Want me to tell you what it is?
Yeah.
Because I used to work when I was younger in a convenience store, and the manager told me that they don't sell that brand anymore because this bread n'utilisait pas de produits de conservation. Puis finalement, ils perdaient tout leur batch de pain. So that's Diana bread, but it's a very from Quebec. That's
That's awesome. They're like, their value is natural and
yeah,
it's all
and
moldy.
they lost the batch of breads. That's the story.
That's awesome. So, or even think about like beta versus VHS, right? Like there's lots of reasons why culture doesn't survive in organizations. And I think that, so it's helpful to think of a few examples, because what you can see is that depending on, whether or not the organization's culture is willing to change, over time, it's going to show whether or not it's sustainable. One of the things that I think about is honestly like the Catholic Church. I was brought up extremely Catholic. Now look how many Catholics there are in Canada, because in a lot of ways, the Catholic Church is not progressing enough for 2020. And so culturally, it's becoming less and less interesting for people in ways that are showing that it's becoming, its survivability is going down potentially. You had your hand up.
I just have a question about the culture. This example happened for the Remembrance Day in a Whole Food store. They have said they don't want to have any of their employee to have any tag, anything who involves something. And even the government was involved, telling that the poppy for the Remembrance Day was a Canadian symbol. After that, Hostful changed his mind and accepted that the Canadian employees were able to use that puppet that previously were. This is part of the culture of the company that they have to adapt to their country.
Yes, absolutely. Because what you're looking at is large, we live in a very globally capitalist economy. So you have these large organizations that are across different countries, like McDonald's, for instance. They probably have an overarching culture, but they also probably have specific ways that it's expressed in different places in order to make sure that it survives. And if it doesn't, like Dominica said about Target, it's going to close. And I remember, Target seemed kind of shocked that it didn't work in Canada, right? So it's interesting to think about Pier 1. I forgot about Pier 1, yeah. And now I'm just thinking about McDonald's. I really want a quarter pounder, I'm not going to lie. Okay. So the organization, and while I'm talking, if you want to put in the chat your favorite McDonald's food, no pressure, just anyone who likes McDonald's, you can. Okay. So the way the textbook talks about culture, and this is going to be important for your essay, is that it looks at 7 primary characteristics that operate on a spectrum. So one of the ways to think about culture is by looking at these 7 primary characteristics. And so one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do is to look at your organization and think about its culture. That's what this final paper is going to be on, is your own organization. And so, it's an opportunity for you to analyze where your organization is at in these characteristics. And so the idea here is that there's 7 and that, it's a spectrum. So if you understand what that means, basically what it means is like a spectrum could be from hot to cold. So cold on the one side, hot on the other, and everything in the middle is somewhat hot, somewhat cold. Does that make sense to people? So the first one is innovation and risk-taking. So how innovative and risk-taking is your culture? So the far end would be very innovative and risk-taking. And on the other side would be the opposite. So if you think about, for instance, Apple versus Microsoft, which one gives you the feeling that it's more innovative? Microsoft or Apple? Just off the top of your head.
Apple?
Yeah, I'd say that that's probably the sense. Whether or not it's true, Daniel's saying BlackBerry, that's hilarious. Whether or not, I always think of the fruit, I'm always so confused, but I also don't know what spilling tea means, so there you go. I think spilling tea is literally spilling tea. So, innovation and risk-taking, even if it's not actually what Apple, maybe Microsoft is as innovative as Apple, but the perception is that, right, Tesla, there you go. What's an innovation and risk-taking organization? So the next one is attention to detail. So, what kind of an organization would culturally be potentially one that has a lot of attention to detail? What type of organization might be focused on detail? Any example you can think of.
An hotel?
A hotel, motel, is that what you said?
No, a hotel, kind of Marriott or a kind of the Ritz-Carlton.
Maybe. Rolex, Canada Goose. Okay, yeah, those are potentials. Finance would probably be more obvious because it's looking at like really specific numbers. I think, you know, you're going to see that there are some organizations that stereotypically fall in, and there's going to be other organizations where they fall in because of their actual practices. Right. So Ferrari, because of all of the details. Yeah, I'd say that's Alan. That's a good example. Disney. Yeah, I think that's also probably true. Right. So outcome orientation. That's how devoted to or concerned is the organization with the outcome. So the profit, making sure that your objectives are getting met there. So what's an organization that might be really profit driven, do you think? And again, you know, we stereotype things and then we look for actual data, so we can make assumptions, but we have to back it up when we're talking about our organizations. But yeah, right. Banks, airlines, medicine, pharmaceuticals, I'd say that's a really great example, right? You know, we see that all the time, even now with the vaccines that people are talking about. The question that I always think about is, are they going to be affordable and accessible to everyone, or are they going to be profit driven as always and make things stupid and make things stupid? That's what I have to say about that. Credit cards, oh my God, so true, right? People orientation, that's an organization that's more focused on relationship and on people. So can you think of a type of organization that but might be more stereotypically considered a people-oriented organization? Maybe hospitality, maybe Walmart. Walmart, that's awesome. Well, there's a greeter, right? I think nonprofits would be one that would be a safe bet because the mandate is not to make money, right? And so they're sort of automatically the opposite of outcome orientation to a certain degree. You know, YMCA, maybe Starbucks, cultural centers. So you can see it's, you know, we're thinking about the UN. So a union wouldn't be an organization in and of itself, right? A union is part of an organization, although maybe an organization that is devoted to helping unions might be. Dominica, what's going on? Cute girl, Dominica. What does that mean? Sorry, am I not supposed to? Was that supposed to be a private chat?
Her daughter.
My daughter showed up.
Oh,
Thank you, Isabel.
Oh my God, I was too busy. I was too busy thinking.
What you think?
Oh, I missed her. I'll have to go and look at the recording and watch it. Okay, that's actually really yeah. Anyway, whatever. Okay, it's so weird this is all being recorded. Okay, and then the next one is aggressiveness. So how aggressive is the organization? You know, is it really competitive? Is it so? What's an aggressive type of organization? Can you think of something that seems like an aggressive organization just off the top of your head? Collection agencies. Oh my God. Real estate, stocks, yes. What about lawyers, law firms? Think of all those law TV shows, the Suits guys, they're brutal, man. And TV is like real life. Sales, yeah, exactly. So we can think of the politics, yeah, totally. And then how stable is it, right? So is it more concerned with sort of a stability, or again, a little bit more about, you know, trying new things, taking risks? So
What's the difference between team orientation and outcome? And people orientation. So.
Oh, team orientation. Sorry, I totally skipped that. Team orientation is, again, so people orientation is about like potentially the client, the individual. Team orientation is more concerned with, are we collaborating in groups?
Okay.
Right. So again, you know, an example of team orientation would probably be Apple. Because they talk a lot about the fact that they work together really collaboratively. A people-oriented culture is going to care about how the client experiences something.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to ask you to do in your final essay is to take a look at these and pick maybe, you know, 3 that you can see that you can talk about in your own organization. So you might want to talk about, oh, you know what, my organization is really people oriented, or it's really not team oriented, or it's really aggressive, or it's not really aggressive. Does that make sense to people? And then you look at the reasons why. So that basically your final essay is looking at stability, public administration. Melissa, that's a great example. That's such a great example. Stability to the point where it's almost like a little bit too traditional, right? It can get a little bit stuck in its ways. So another way to look at organizational culture, and this isn't in the textbook, and it's not going to be on your final paper, but I think it's still really interesting. It's something that I learned from another consultant this year, and I think it's really helpful when we think about what organizational culture is. And what this talks about is that organizational culture has three components: the mindsets of people, the skill sets of people, and the structure. And what that means is that if I'm in a culture where structurally we have policies that are anti-racist, but the mindset of people isn't anti-racist, and I haven't been skilled up to understand that, are we going to have a culture that's anti-racist? Probably not, even though the structures are there. If you have a mindset where all the people really want that to be part of how you operate, but there's no structure involved, is that going to be an organization that is going to be anti-racist culturally? What do you think? I care about it, you care about it, the other person cares about it. We have no policies or procedures or resources going towards it, which is the structural part. The structural part is also hierarchy. So who's in leadership, right? So if we all care about it, but our structure has nothing that relates to anti-racism, do you think that the culture is going to be anti-racist? What do you think? Yes or no? Yeah, no, right? So these three things relate to each other. And so often what I do when I'm working with organizations, and I didn't actually even realize this until this was pointed out to me by another consultant that works in organizational change, is that you can actually look at these three aspects of an organization to understand where it needs to shift its culture. If it's saying, oh, we want this, but we don't have the skills, and we also don't have the structure, you're not going to focus on shifting mindset. You're going to focus on skilling people up and looking at structural change. So it helps us identify what parts of a culture need to shift. Does that make sense to people? It's another way we can start identifying, for instance, where a culture might be not walking the walk. Because, you know, our mindset is this is great, but we don't have the skill set. Or we have the skill sets, but we don't actually care. So these things interact with each other, and all three of these things have to be in harmony in order for a culture to be cohesive. If one of them is out of whack, the culture won't be able to express itself the way that it wants to. So, you know, this isn't in your textbook. This isn't going to be something that I ask you to explain in your essay, but I thought it was a really helpful, in my mind, you know, the 7 characteristics, they're helpful, they're interesting, but to me, this is actually, I'd say something that when it comes to the work that I do, I use this a lot more. I don't tend to focus very much on the 7 characteristics in the same way, because in some ways, what I'm really curious about when I work with organizations is, where is your culture at and where would you like it to be? And to understand where culture is at, I do the things that you guys are talking about. I observe, I talk to people, I see how they interact, I see what they write about themselves, all those things. And then we look at, okay, like this is what you say you are. Where's your mindset, skill sets, and structures in relationship to that and where you want to go?
Can we get an example about skills, mindset, structure?
Sure. So, I mean, I was giving a few, but I'm going to think of, okay, so recently I was working with an organization at the beginning of the year where they really wanted to be more collaborative. They had 2 teams and they were working incredibly separately. It was unbelievable how separate these teams were. And everybody was saying, we really want to be one team. We're acting like 2 teams, but we want to be one team. And so their mindset, which is how they think, is let's be more collaborative. but the structures that were in place in the organization did not help that at all. There were separate sides of the room. So physically they were on different sides. They had different Google Drives. There were no procedures or policies that talked about how to work together. And all the different pay scales were totally separated by the teams. And so all the structures reinforced their separateness. So the mindset is let's work together, but the structure wasn't helping that. And then the skill sets, they had never done it before. And so they didn't know how to ask each other for help, or how to collaborate across team, or how to work together in a way that was cohesive. And then on top of it, another part of the structure that had a really big impact was hierarchy. So part of structure, and we're going to learn this, is the organizational chart. Do people know what that is? It's sort of like who's on first, who's on second, who's on third. If you're in a hierarchy, it's that sort of picture of whose boss is who. And in this organization, their structure was such so that the person who was in charge of the one team had total power to tell them they couldn't work with the other team. And that's what was going on. And so that, again, the mindset of the majority of people were let's collaborate, but the structure kept stopping it. And so as a group, we had to talk that through. Okay, if you want to collaborate together, let's look at what parts of your structure are helping you do that, and what parts of your structure are actually hindering you in that. What part of your skills do you need to develop in order to create a culture that's more collaborative? Does that help as an example? So that's how the three things relate. And it can be really, really helpful to think about. If you find that you're in a culture where it feels a bit off, or it doesn't feel totally harmonized, you can think about, well, what are the things about the structure that support the kind of culture that our mindsets that we talk about? And do we have the skill sets to actually be culturally where we want to be? Another really good example of this is cultures that talk about the mindset of support and engagement for people. Okay, so we have a culture where the mindset is we motivate our employees, we engage them, etc. But that supervisors and managers do not have the skill sets to lead properly. Has anyone experienced that? So, the mindset is we empower our people. The skill set is I have no idea how to empower anybody. I've never been taught how to lead well. And as you're going to see, if you haven't already watched the module on leadership, leadership is not this one size fits all. You're born a leader, like Simba in The Lion King. That's the only time when leadership was something that he was just born a leader, was Simba. So that's kind of a way to understand the mindset, skill set, and structure part of these cultures. Okay. So, yeah, North Korea. The circle of life. I actually don't know that song very well. Like I don't know it enough. Yeah, I know, right? I should just stop. Okay. So, I actually am too old for Lion King. I'm way more like the Fox and the Hound guys and Robin Hood. Sorry. Hakuna Matata for the rest of your days. It's a Southern philosophy. Hakuna Matata. If anybody other than us watch these videos, they would think it's so weird. Okay. So what I want you to do now is to look at these two different organizations, okay? So in organization A, managers fully document all decisions. Creative decisions, change, and risks aren't encouraged. Extensive rules exist for everyone. Productivity is valued over employee morale. So that's the outcome as opposed to the people orientation. Employees are encouraged to stay within their own department. That would be individualization as opposed to team orientation, and individual effort is encouraged. That's again the opposite of team orientation. In organization B, management encourages and rewards risk-taking and change. So they're more innovative. Employees are encouraged to run with ideas. Employees have few rules and regulations, so they're probably a little bit less stable. Productivity is balanced with treating people right, so it's people oriented, and team members are encouraged to interact with people at all levels and functions. That's the team orientation we were talking about. and many rewards are team-based. That's again the team orientation. So what I want you to do is to take a screenshot of this again, or just think about, they're quite different, right? They're almost like stereotypes in some ways. I don't think any organization is fully one or the other. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you into breakout rooms again. And what I want you to do this time is to, as you can imagine, just discuss with each other. And this is, again, going to be a pretty quick little conversation. But if you had a choice between working between organization A and organization B, which one would you prefer to work in? And it's interesting because I think that sometimes people see them and they think it's going to be obvious, but I think that you're going to see that everybody has a really different idea often of what kind of organization that they would prefer. So I have a couple of questions here, but just focus on which organization you'd prefer. Don't worry about all of the 3 questions, just which one do you want to work for and why. So the rooms are open so you can join, and I'll just give you like maybe 6 minutes and then we'll come back.
Can you show it again so I can take a picture?
Yeah, for sure.
Please.
Yeah, because I don't know what they are.
There you go.
Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, shit. Thank you.
No problem. I'm going to pause recording. So just remind me to start it again if you don't mind, if anybody can. Okay, so this is Cleo, is seriously the best cat ever. Look at this kitten.
What is his name? What
I
did he
named her
name?
Cleo.
Oh, that's nice, sweet.
Yeah. She's like literally just hanging right out. Okay. So what organization? Type in the chat which one you'd prefer to work for. Okay, so a lot of B's. I love it. Alexander's like my own. It's great. Wow, Rashmi, you work in B. That's awesome. Okay, so there's, I think one person had A. I think Enar. Enar, tell me about A. What do you like about A? Because I think that A is a good organization. Like it's not, neither are good or bad, right? They're just different.
I think for what I was telling to my colleagues, my team workers, is more when it's not that to work alone, but it's the individuality of work. I was saying that in some point when you start working, you go into certain pattern that is very hard for you to change to A to B. For me, A is more structured. It's example and an exam. Okay, when I do my exam, I go question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. It's very hard for me to skip one question in order to follow. I am very square, very extremely organized, and is the way to follow. So working in a team-based organization for me is more struggling to not to participate, but to feel confident on it,
right.
To delegate, and maybe I am completely disagree what others do. So it's more independent, I will say.
Yeah, so I think it's it's a really interesting point is that, yeah, and Megan is saying that that she agrees. And so I think that it's interesting too, because Daniel's saying that A sounds like low-key toxic. And I think that, can you see that could B be toxic? Could B be toxic? And this is the interesting thing is that, on paper, any organization, like certain organizations might seem healthier than others, and so what we want to do is we want to actually look at how does that play itself out? Because you can see how B has a lot of things that probably I would rather have, but to Enar's point, does it have enough structure? Does it have enough, there needs to be a balance in every organization. And I think other people are also saying that it's important to, and I think this is very true, it's important to go with organizations that fit what you're going to be wanting. Some people want more flexibility. Some people don't care as much about structure. Some people, and so it's funny because even with Cleo, this little kitten, my friend Baj and I were taking care of her for the first few days together, and his approach was really different. Who has kids and finds that their parenting style is very different than if you're with someone else who's also looking after your kids, right? So our styles have a lot to do with how we see organizational culture. So it's something important to think about. So it's just it's interesting and important to think about how different organizational cultures aren't inherently good or bad. You have to actually sort of dig a bit deeper to see. One of the things that we talk about in terms of identifying an organization's culture are the things that you've already mentioned, right? So when we were talking about how do you identify what an organization's culture is, you were speaking to what do people say to each other? What are the values and the beliefs? What are the norms? The way that organizational behavior talks about this is from this perspective of artifacts and the deeper culture. So these are terms that are really specific to OB, to organizational behavior. So they're important to think of in that way. So artifacts to me sounds a lot like Indiana Jones. Has anyone seen Indiana Jones? Some of them are really bad, but some of them are really good. The one with him and Sean Connery is awesome. It's such a good movie. Anyway, but Indiana Jones is an archaeologist. So what he does is he goes around, he digs up items, and those items tell him stories about certain cultures, right? And so in a similar way, l'Arche d'Alliance is that the name of it in French?
I think it's the Le Coffre with the Sean Connery.
Yeah, it's the one where they're fighting the Nazis together. He's his dad.
Yeah, that's l'Arche d'Alliance in French.
Oh my God, it's such a good movie. I love that movie.
Yeah.
Sean Connery, rest in peace. Anyway, whatever. He's Scottish. He's my people. Okay. So when we look at artifacts, what we're looking at in organizational cultures are things like language, material symbols, the stories that people tell, the rituals that a culture has. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, yeah, I didn't like that one as much, but it's not about what I like, it's what we all like. And then underneath that are the shared assumptions, values, and beliefs. And the reason why I made the slide the way that I did is because it sort of shows that the shared assumptions, beliefs, and values are expressed like a volcano through the artifacts, but they're underneath the surface. Some of the values and beliefs will be on mission statements and vision statements, but we've already seen that there's other values and beliefs operating that we don't talk about. So for instance, what Betty was saying about her experience of, not being asked back for whatever unknown reason and thinking, is this something to do with the value of the culture that they're not expressing, but that I'm experiencing? So let's take a look at what artifacts, some examples of artifacts. And so one of the things to think about is language. So, are there words? And when we talk about language, we're not talking about, Arabic, English, Urdu, French, whatever it is. We're not talking about different languages. We're actually talking about the words that are used in an organization. So if you think about, for instance, Starbucks, they have specific language that they use for specific things, like, and they train not only their staff, but also, clients. When you go into Starbucks, you have to say grande latte or whatever it is, right? So they teach you that there are certain, I used to refuse. I'd be like, I'm having a medium, just because I hate feeling like I'm being told what to do. Sorry, I'm just looking for my cat. Oh, the other she is. But they have this certain approach to language that's really specific. And maybe if anyone can think of any other examples of organizations, yeah. Oh my God, that's such a good example, Duya. Acronyms. Who here started working in an organization and they're like, oh yeah, call the LLBC for the DDYF for the NPQ, and you're just like, what? And no one explains it.
I had an example, like I used to work for an airline as well. at for transit. And then I changed from there. I used to call the people that I used to speak on the phone was the passengers. And then I changed
Right.
for public administration, and they were no longer passengers, but I was still referring to them as yes, the passenger, and it was no longer the passenger, it was the client or the citizen called.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, Melissa, that's a great example. Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, right. Tango Sierra Bravo. I only know that from I think like some action movies. Yeah, nicknames of people, like so all that is an example of language, and it tells you what a culture is trying to be like. You know, material symbols, you know, the office layout, the size of the office, the dress codes. You know, for instance, the material symbols of the organization that I was working at, where there was the two teams that were really divided, they were physically divided too. You know, so that's a material artifact that is a clue to how the organization's culture operates. You know, the stories that it tells, you know, are there success stories that you're always hearing, or, you know, stories that are repeated, like the mythology of an organization, or even stories at the water cooler. So when we're spilling the tea, are there certain people? See how effortlessly I said that this time? Are there certain people that, you know, are bad and other people are good? And what does that talk about? You know, so for instance, sometimes you'll hear in certain organizations, different departments not liking each other, and there's nothing really there other than the mythology of not liking each other, and that's about the organizational cultural need to have some kind of divide. There's a really interesting organizational consultant from the 1960s, a woman named Isabel Menzies, and she used to study nurses in healthcare. And what she noticed, I don't know if anyone is in healthcare here, but what she noticed is that the nurses sort of made sure that the doctors didn't feel the anxiety of dealing with dying patients. And so what they spoke about, the stories that they would tell each other, would keep that organizational culture sort of very separate in order to ensure that the culture could sort of maintain a certain level of detachment. Really, really interesting stuff. Is this making sense? You know,
Question
so
about stories. Ooh,
yes.
sorry. I
Go
was
for it.
wondering if you see, like, let's say, for example, reviews online on a specific business, or when you're applying to a job, you go on Glassdoor to see what the reviews are in the company. Would they be considered as stories as well?
You know, I think that they could. From my perspective, yes, because there's what the organization says and then the stories that you hear about it, right? So there's the informal stories. And what I would say is that, like, you know, you go, you get a professor, you look them up on My Teacher, and if everybody says that they are a pain in the butt, you start to, but there's a culture around that, right? And so I think the narrative that we tell ourselves informally in my mind is part of the stories that we understand as part of the organizational culture, for sure. And then there's the rituals involved, right? So the town hall meetings, recognition programs, onboarding practices, there's that Walmart chant, right? So there's different ways in which artifacts express themselves. You know, we also talk about, and this is something that's going to be that I'm going to be asking you to look at in your essay, is a culture strong or weak? And so the idea here is not, is a culture more aggressive? You know, we often think of strength as like competitive or aggressive if we're thinking about, you know, wrestling or something. I love how you guys are still doing all of the tango, blah, 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 blah. That's amazing. That cracks me up. This is one of the things about chat that we're going to miss if we go back to school. Like, if we're in class, you can't have this like sidebar conversation without being, you know what I mean? And it's actually kind of fun to see anyway. So when it comes to cultures being strong or weak, basically what this means is text messages. Yeah, but I don't let people have cell phones in my class, so you guys would be screwed. Anyway, a culture that's strong is a culture where everybody kind of buys in to the beliefs and the values and the assumptions. A culture that's weak is a culture where people don't really buy into it. So you show up, you do your job, but it's not really something that people feel very connected to or care about. And that there's subcultures that emerge, and that happens everywhere, especially in bigger organizations. But the more subcultures, the more fracturing happens. Does that make sense to people? So a weak culture is a culture where at the heart of it, the norms, the values, the beliefs aren't really something that a lot of people buy into. Can you think of an example of what you might consider to be a strong culture? What's an organization that strikes you as having a strong culture where everybody seems to buy into it? Lush, that's a great example. I would think that that's true. IKEA, yeah, I think Apple probably as well. Probably Google, right? So we think of these cultures as places where people partially work there because they want to work there. Like, I want to work at Lush because I care about the values, Lush seems kind of progressive in that way. Okay, so there's good food. I don't know that quite as well, but that sense that, somebody is, if you're proud of working at an organization. BMW, CIBC or Royal Bank, Wikipedia. So there's lots of different examples, right? What about organizations that you might consider to be having weaker cultures, where people might work there just to have a job? Yeah, actually, I was thinking, it's so funny because the first thing I thought of was McDonald's. I worked at McDonald's for 5 years. I've had over 300 quarter pounders. I once did a calculation. That number will grow as I get older because I'm not going to stop eating there. But it's not like I was like, oh, McDonald's, you're the best. Like, it was literally because I was 15 living in a shitty town in southwestern Ontario, and that was the best I could do. Yeah, Fido, Rogers, grocery stores, fast food, Tim Hortons, totally. Like, I don't think there's a lot of people that are like, Tim Hortons, So, and it's an interesting question. What makes those cultures weak versus what makes other cultures strong? So in a strong culture, everyone's really kind of feeling on the same page, right? Like, oh my God, call center is so true. A strong culture, we're all going towards the same goal. That's the idea. So we're not going to watch this tonight because I want to be able to end by 8, but it's a really funny video to check out because it's basically Apple's recruiting video. So if you watch it, you'll see how it shows itself in this certain type of way. And I think that you can kind of poke holes at, is this actually Apple or is it what they're trying to tell you? So it could be interesting for you to watch and just take and to consider. I've never seen the Heineken hiring video. I should watch it. Apparently at Apple, and again, these are all the mythologies of organizations, right? But I've heard, I think there was somebody that used to work there. Anyway, it's like my best friend's other friend's cousin told me once that when you go through the recruiting process of being potentially hired at Apple, they actually watch videos of their products and see how you react. And if you react like a bit bored, they're not going to hire you. Whereas if you're like, wow, they'll give you the job. I mean, who knows if that's true, right? But it just kind of shows you how these mythologies emerge about different cultures. Lily, you should share the Heineken hiring video on our Facebook so I can see it. Okay. So, I guess none of this really matters unless we're looking at what a healthy culture can be, right? So in my mind, again, a healthy culture is not how square is it, how squiggle is it, how circle is it, how triangle is it, right? Enar wants to work at company A. I want to work at company B. Those are both valid things to want. The issue is the culture actually healthy? And so, the indications that a healthy culture might be at risk is when there's too much bureaucratic institutionalization, when it gets too stuck and too many loopholes and too many rules and too many processes, too much structure, and it takes too long to get things done. And you can see how that actually has major impacts on things. Like if you look at COVID or any sort of major incident that happens is the culture that we're living in, or is it so bureaucratic that it's actually hard to be efficient and like have things change quickly, right? So Isabel is saying CHSLD, yeah, right? So like thinking about healthcare and how that operates, and we're gonna on December 2nd, the Thursday, I'm gonna send out a video that I'm gonna be doing with my friend Dr. Bajyanta Mukhopadhyay, who's going to be talking about the healthcare system in Quebec. He's a doctor here and he works in a lot of different places, and he's going to talk about how the structure of the healthcare system has an impact on patient outcomes. And so he's going to really look at what happens when you have a culture that is highly bureaucratic. A healthy culture might be at risk when there is resistance to change. And what I mean by this is too much resistance. Whenever there's change, there's going to be resistance. And I think it's actually really important to listen to respect. But if there's an inability to change, and again, I'm thinking the Catholic Church, it might not survive. And when we look at a culture as almost like a bee or a beehive, if the beehive is somewhere where there's water that's pouring down and it's not willing to move, it's going to die. Same idea. If you're so resistant to change that you're not able to see what's going on and make some significant change to make sure you're going to survive, then you're going to, you're not going to make it out. Your grandmother is in one of them, in a CHSL. I thought you meant in the Catholic Church. And I was like, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know. Nothing wrong with being a Catholic, by the way. I'm one myself, so there you go. Not practicing, but if you are, that's super cool. Okay, ongoing maladaptive behavior. So we looked earlier about how if your culture has certain behavior, it's because it was working at a certain point. Who here feels like there are things that you could change about how you relate to things that you used to, that you're just used to doing, that don't serve you as well anymore? Anyone? I'm going to put my hand up for that. Who here feels like there's some things that they don't do anymore that they used to do because it no longer works? You've matured, how you behave, you're just realizing like, right.
I've learned to pick your battles.
Right.
Just
exactly.
pick your battles.
Yeah, man. Malika's saying by time and experience. Absolutely, right? So organizations often have a really hard time doing this, but the behavior that they experience that worked over time, if they survive, ultimately might not work. And so that question of, can I adapt my behavior as an organization to my current reality? And if they can't, then it's going to be really hard to have a healthy culture. And part of that is, a resistance to diversity and inclusion, because, we're 2020. It should always be like that anyway. But we're at a point where if you're unable to recognize what you need to do to be a healthy organization, I don't think that your survivability is going to be ultimately that sustainable. So these are the types of things that we look at when we look at, is an organization healthy? We don't think about, is it type A or type B? We're like, what are your sort of fundamental ways in which you're responding to your environment? Dominica, what's your question?
When you say if they're resistant to change and ultimately the organization is going to die or whatnot. Just this Sunday, I don't know if you watched Sunday Morning on CBS, they had Barack Obama on, and they had asked him a question, and they said, what do you think after you've been president for 8 years? What's the legacy you left? What has changed? What didn't change? And he said exactly what we're talking about. He goes, I tried to change things, Obamacare, the healthcare reform. And he's like, the whole government, the whole institution, he goes, quote, is a steamship. He goes, as much as I wanted things to go fast, he goes, I just realized that things are gonna only see the changes 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now. So he's saying himself that it's very bureaucratic, it's very slow, it's an elephant, it's a monster. But if this is what it is, and it's not going to change, or it's going to be resistant to change, how is it going to die? Like, how is it that you say it's not going to survive?
I think it's a great question. I mean, you know, not to be too fatalistic or anything, but you know, if we look at the environment and climate change, you know, that's a response that the earth is having in relationship to what we're doing. You know, the idea that the capitalist system or that the American way of working democracy is something that's been around forever is not true. It's hundreds of years old, which isn't actually that old, right? So if we look at history in a larger context, things do change. How they change, I think, is really interesting. Usually, I think that when we're talking about large systems changing, it's through incredibly tense situations where you know, there's either war or, you know, some kind of violence, right? What I think is so exciting, and I don't think I'm going to see this in my lifetime, but that as human beings, I think we're fully capable of actually learning the skill sets of recognizing when change needs to happen and doing it more mindfully. But that means a lot of things I don't think we're ready for yet. Letting go of ego, seeing systems for what they are. I mean, I was reading a really interesting article today about the Electoral College, and not to get too into American politics right now, but the Electoral College was built on slavery. It was built on the idea that the southern states needed more votes because Black people in the South couldn't vote. And so that if you looked at the population in total, the white people in the South were so small in numbers, they were worried that they would never get a voice.
Wow.
And I can send that article out. It's really interesting to look at and read and think about, because the thing is that we're in 2020 and we're still voting in that way, right? And so if we look at how do we change these systems, we have, and again, this gets back to culture, right? Mindset, skill set, and structure. So you can have the mindset that Barack Obama does. You can have the skill set that he has. The structure is still the same as it was in the 1800s. So what needs to change is, I think, some deeply structural things. And in terms of how that happens, I think one of the reasons why within organizations it is rewarding to do the work is because it's not as massive as, you know, the global economy or North American politics. You know, so I think it can get very overwhelming if we think about, oh my God, what is it going to take, right?
We're going to change democracy in the US.
I mean, we can keep having these conversations, we can keep moving things forward, we can keep thinking about the kind of world that we want to have, and we can hope to be a drop in the bucket, really, I think. But I think it's a really interesting question, because I think that oftentimes people that are in organizational change expect to see massive shifts in organizations that, to Barack Obama's point, have us our steamships. I think that's a really, and the more institutional and the more bureaucratic an organization is, the more of a steamship it is. And so it's kind of like, you know, if you're canoeing and you want to change directions, it doesn't take that much energy. If you're in a giant steamship, there's a lot more to consider to move a little bit. And I know this because I'm a canoe expert and I also drive steamships. Those are the two things that I'm really good at. Okay, so I know. So this here is something that I just wanted to quickly show you because it shows sort of the life cycle of anything, of all living things. It's from ecology. Actually, there's a guy, Bert Hollinger, that came up with this idea a while ago. Yeah, Alexander. Yeah, I have no idea. I'm not bad in a canoe, but definitely not a steamship expert. But anyway, he talked about how there's sort of this cycle that goes from gestation to birth to maturity and creative destruction, and then it goes back to gestation. And this idea that he's saying is basically that everything starts out as a seed or whatever, and that it needs a lot of care and attention at first. Then it matures. You know, so you can think of like a forest, and at a certain point it needs to be destroyed to be renewed. And that in the forest modality, that's what we call maturation. The idea is that if you don't have some creative destruction, you're going to actually fall into stagnancy. And we see this in ecology, right? Like forest fires, the way that we see them now, are often not really useful because they're not managed by you know, the sort of regulatory sense of the system. They come from an external factor, often humans or climate change, but that, you know, forests regenerate themselves. They have forest fires. Do people know about this? It's something that happens once in a while that actually allows for further growth. Or if you think about farmers, they don't, if they're doing it in a way that, and I think most farmers are like this, you're not going to plant a field over and over and over and over again. You need time for the field to rest. And so basically what we're looking at is if a culture stays too much in the baby phase and doesn't give itself enough structure and attention, it's gonna fail. So to Enar's point, there needs to be structure, there needs to be, you know, systems, there needs to be organization, there needs to be resources to support it. By the same token, if a culture gets stuck in maturity and doesn't change, if it becomes too resistant to change, it's not going to be able to creatively destroy itself and have renewal. Does that make sense to people? I think this is a helpful image for me when I think about, you know, my own life, when I think about organizations that I work with, and I see how we sometimes get stuck. Because the maturity phase feels good. It's like there's all these trees, I feel comfortable, I have what I need. And so it's hard to move out of because it feels like we're losing control. But what creative destruction does is it allows for a clearing of old ideas, for a commitment to what's present, yeah, the need to evolve, right? And so that's something that a lot of organizations really struggle with. Okay, so I'm gonna go through the last few slides and then we'll end for the night. So, you know, how is culture created and sustained? So a big part of that is leadership. And a big part of leadership is the founders. So the people who start an organization can impact its culture even after they're gone. So, you know, whatever organization you're in, there were people that started it, and their approach is probably still felt in the organization. They can have passed away, and that can still be the case. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. It's like, you know, family, like the matriarchs and the patriarchs of family can leave their legacy, and in the same way, organizations founders can really impact the culture. Leadership has a huge impact on culture, especially in hierarchical organizations. You know, words and behavior establishes the norms. And so people really look to leadership to see what the model is, right? So if leadership is acting a certain way, it's okay for me to act a certain way and vice versa. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, if you are a leader in your organization, it's really important to think about, because in some ways leadership can set the cultural tone in ways that prove to be really, really powerful. Staff also create and sustain culture. And so what that means is, you know, employees being hired based on fit, ensuring that staff behavior aligns with cultural norms. So getting in trouble if you're sort of out of line in terms of behaviors. So selection of employees helps sustain a culture, and the socialization of employees helps to sustain a culture. So you're selected because maybe the culture thinks you're going to be a good fit, but then how you're socialized also sort of reinforces that. So for instance, you know, how you're oriented, the training programs, and then your informal and formal feedback of how to act. So you get lots of cues all the time. And if you've been in an organization for a while, maybe those cues you don't think about anymore. But at a certain point, you were told how to behave in an organization. Does that make sense to people? And for who do you feel like you know, what's more powerful, the informal or the formal feedback? Anyone? You know, just from based on your own personal experience, what's more powerful, what the formal is, or yeah, the ongoing? Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. Where do you get your cues? What has weight, you know? Because both are really, you know, key and help you sustain the culture. And ultimately, if you don't fit in, you might find yourself either getting fired or deciding to leave. You know, I think that, and it can be for reasons that you don't understand. So why is this all relevant to us? You know, so, you know, culture really conveys a sense of identity to organizations members. It helps create commitment beyond your self-interests. It's your social glue. You know, and it also helps us make sense of our organization. What's this story of where I work? Ultimately, what it does is it creates work climate. And what work climate is just that sort of general sense of what your organization is like on the day-to-day. So this includes, you know, how creative, how communicative, how warm, how supportive, how safe, how much justice, how much diversity, etc. To result in better outcomes for everybody. Climate will influence your behavior. If you have a good climate, you might consider, you know, doing extra without complaining, or sticking around, or mentoring, like Alan's saying, right? If you have a negative climate, you probably won't be doing those things in the same way. Okay, so real quick before we go, which of these do you think is McGill? So one of them is, I think on one of the websites of McGill anyway, what they say their values are. All of these are different universities, Canadian universities. One is UBC, one is Concordia, one is York, and one is McGill. So which one do you think is McGill based on your experience of the culture? So everybody's saying D so far. Does anyone think it's something other than D? There's a B. Okay, so D's and B's. So it's actually A. That's what McGill says. But what's really interesting is, again, what we say and how people experience it are different, right? So it's just interesting to think about the ways in which culture is experienced and the ways in which culture is actually manifest. Yeah, I mean, if you look at A, none of those things really strike me as what McGill would say its culture is. You know, that word excellence, I hear like every single, you know, millisecond. And that gets back to what we were talking about earlier. But what does excellence mean? Oh, it's like highest marks possible. We get back to where we were talking at the beginning of class, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so that's it for tonight.